Hi there, and welcome to Chapter 6b of this wonderful study, The Future of the Great Planet Earth, and we're interpreting Matthew 24, Part 2. I'm James Preston, and we're doing a whole study of the end-time passages of Scripture, and what do they really mean, and how can we interpret them responsibly. So let's get straight into it. We picked up from the last session in Matthew 24, our interpretation of Matthew 24, which is based on chapter 6 of my book. We picked up, Jesus was talking about the famines, he was talking about wars and rumors of wars, and then we had to end it there. So we're going to pick it up from there and continue with what Jesus was prophesying. The last session we gave a lot of context to why Jesus was saying what he was saying and why Jesus is saying these things, why he's making these prophecies. We picked up the context was the Jewish religious system. He was in the temple when he prophesied some powerful things to the Jewish people, to the leaders especially, and then he said that the temple would be completely destroyed. So it is in that context that Jesus is saying these things. And then in the earlier session, 2 videos back, we spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that's key. I want you to understand that, and I hope you're starting to see now what we spoke about in that session, which is based on chapter 5 of my book, how significant 70 AD's destruction of Jerusalem was, especially in relation to this chapter of Matthew, which is one of the most talked about chapters when it comes to the end times. So let's get straight into it and continue where we left off in the last video. In verse 7 of Matthew 24, Jesus talks about earthquakes and great earthquakes and these kind of things. Now, we know that the earth quaked when Jesus died. And we also know that when he rose, he quaked as well. But not only that, there's actually a lot of evidence that in the years before Jerusalem fell, there was unusually high seismic activity. The most famous of these being the earthquake that destroyed Pompeii in 63 AD. That just goes to show how great the seismic activity was. It really was a time of a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that happening. And of course, the big one being when Jesus died, there was an earthquake, and when Jesus rose again, there was an earthquake as well. So certainly, Jesus did say that there would be earthquakes. Historians and writers from that period also tell us that there were significant earthquakes in Colossia, in Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Campania, Crete, Rome, and Judea. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the tectonic plates and tectonic plate movement. So there certainly was stuff going on, and Jesus wasn't wrong if he was speaking about a time very soon after his death and ascension. Then he says in verse 9 that these are just the beginning of birth pains. Now, many people think that modern day natural disasters are such birth pangs or birth pains, but that discredits Jesus' words of this generation, which he said a little bit later on, and he said to the Jewish leaders in chapter 23 as well. You see, these were birth pains leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. These things starting to happen, the earthquakes, the wars, the false Christs, the famine, these were all things that were birth pains leading up to the great destruction of Jerusalem. Have a look at what John Chrysostom writes in his book, The Ancient Christian Commentary. In speaking of birth pains, he speaks of the preludes to the troubles of the Jews. That is, of the troubles that will befall them. And then in verse 9, Jesus talks about persecution. And we know in Acts verse 1, it actually says, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church. It continued to spread so much that even King Herod got involved in this persecution. We see that in Acts chapter 12, verse 1. In 64 AD, the persecution became even more intense. There was a great fire in Rome, which was even more devastating than 9/11. It wiped out apparently up to 1/3 of the city of Rome, and it's actually believed to have been caused by Emperor Nero in preparation for a large palace. The stories go that he was trying to raise some buildings so that he could actually raze as an R-A-Z-E, raze to the ground some buildings so that he could prepare a great big palace, and the citizens didn't let him. They didn't want him to, they didn't want to leave and vacate the premises. They didn't want him to take over this land. So he actually planned a fire, and the fire got so out of control, it completely burnt up and consumed 1/3 of the city. Now, what Emperor Nero did was he actually placed the Christians, or he placed the blame on the Christians. And historians point out that the great persecution was the result of this. After Nero had placed the blame on the Christians, there was a huge persecution against Christianity because they believed that the Christians were responsible for this devastating fire. The historian Tacitus actually writes how thousands of Christians were tortured, covered in animal skins, then torn to death by dogs, nailed to crosses, covered in tar, and lit on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens while he entertained guests. And that comes from Tacitus' book, The Annals of Imperial Rome, by Cornelius Tacitus. I mean, this was a serious persecution that the Christians faced at that time. And then Jesus goes on to say that there would be great apostasy and there would be false prophets. He says people would be falling away from the faith and false prophets would arise. Now, we need to remember that not long after Jesus had died, Paul started to experience this, and he started to write to his various churches and followers to watch out for false prophets. And then we know that John explained that during his lifetime, many false prophets had gone out into the world. If you look at 1 John 4 verse 1, he actually says that many false prophets and many antichrists have already gone out into the world. Peter warned the same thing in 2 Peter 2 verse 1. He warned that false prophets arose, and notice it's arose, it's a past tense thing, among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. So to his writers, Peter's saying there would be many false prophets and false teachers who will secretly introduce destructive heresies. Now, firstly, we look at it was the Judaizers who wanted to bring Gentiles back into religious bondage as addressed by Paul in Galatians 3. And then we know the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that Jesus hadn't come in the flesh, and they took such a hold on Christianity that about 1/3 of all Christians were involved in Gnosticism by the year 150 AD. That is a significant number. Just think about that. 1/3 of your entire faith being Gnostic, being part of a heretical belief. That's a major false prophecy. And the Apostle John deals with Gnosticism extensively in his first epistle, 1 John. And he actually says that the Gnostics were antichrists. That's what he was talking about when he spoke about antichrists. And then we move on to Matthew 24:14, where Jesus says, "And then the gospel will be preached to all nations, and then the end shall come." Well, we know the gospel was proclaimed to all nations within the generation of the apostles. Have a look at these. Romans 1 verse 8, Paul actually says the gospel had been proclaimed throughout the whole world. Romans 10:18, their voice has gone out into all the earth. And I do apologize for my spelling of there for any grammar Nazis who may be upset with that. That's a slight error. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Romans 16:25-26. Paul says, according to my gospel has been made known to all nations. And it just continues. Colossians 1:5-6 says, the gospel which has come to you just as in all the world, it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing. Colossians 1:23, the gospel was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. And many people look at the question, or rather they look at this and they question it because they believe that it does not mean the whole world in the original Greek. But in Romans 1 verse 8 and Colossians 1 verse 6, Paul uses the Greek word meaning the entire cosmos. He actually says that this gospel has been proclaimed to the entire cosmos. So that's a pretty all-encompassing point that Paul is making. But not only that, Paul uses the Greek word oikumene, which means civilized world. And in Romans 10:18, that's the word that he uses. He says, my gospel has been preached to the whole civilized world. But what's interesting is, Matthew 24:14, Jesus uses the same Greek word. He says, this gospel shall be preached to the whole civilized world. And Paul actually used the same statement, saying the gospel has been preached to the whole civilized world. Have a look at Eusebius. He writes this. He says, the teaching of the new covenant was born to all nations, and then at once the Romans besieged Jerusalem and destroyed it and the temple. So you can see in history, historical writings rarely tend to agree with this way of looking at Matthew chapter 24. And also that book was published in 1920. It is not the time that Eusebius would have written it, of course. And then Justin Martyr writes in the Ante-Nicene Fathers' First Apology, he says, from Jerusalem there went out into the world men 12 in number. By the power of God they proclaimed to every race of men that they were sent by Christ to teach all the word of God. So these men were the disciples, and they went out into all the world. This was the common viewpoint in the church right the way up to around about the 20th century. Jesus says, then the end shall come. Which end was he referring to? Well, we have to remember that he's answering the first question, which was the disciples' response to the temple being destroyed. He's still in his first question. The context of this is still the first question. He's answering that first question by the disciples, which referred to when will these things happen, and that is the temple getting destroyed. So that's the end he's talking about in verse 14. When he says, then the end shall come, he means then the end of the old religious system, the end of the temple shall come. Charles Spurgeon writes, there was sufficient interval for the full proclamation of the gospel by the apostles and evangelists of the early Christian church, and for the gathering of those who recognized the crucified Christ as the true Messiah. That's key. I want you just to remember that point right there. Who recognized the crucified Christ, they were gathered. Notice that Charles Spurgeon writes, and for the gathering out of those who recognize the crucified Christ. We're going to have a look at that. That's key for my next verse. But this point as well is very significant because he's actually saying that there was a full proclamation of the gospel by the apostles and evangelists of the early Christian church. And then came the awful end which the Savior foresaw and foretold. All right, so let's move on. Matthew chapter 24 from verse 15 to 20, and Jesus warns of great destruction. And he uses words where he actually says that those who are in Judea must flee. That's key to understand. He doesn't say people who are in the whole world or wherever you are. He says those who are in Judea must flee. Now, a lot of people have taken chapter 24, and especially this verse, and said, we must flee. But flee, if it's the whole world, if the whole world is going to be destroyed, flee from what? Do you see the logic in this? Jesus uses the word Judea, and he's referring to people who would be in Jerusalem at the time of this destruction. He warned if it came on a Sabbath, particularly applicable to Jewish people. You see, he says, woe to you if it comes on a Sabbath, if this destruction comes on a Sabbath, because the Jews were extremely careful to do any work on a Sabbath. And so if there was a war on the Sabbath, the Jews would have been very reluctant to really get involved or to flee or to run, because it would have been against their nature. It would have gone against their grain. So very significant that Jesus said that. And then he spoke about the housetops. Now, why would Jesus refer to housetops if he was talking about the whole world? Because we've got to understand he's talking to Jerusalem citizens. And these Jerusalem citizens, these Jerusalem Jews, had flat roofs. It was common in Jerusalem for houses not to have the normal triangular apex roofs. They had housetops where they would climb up the stairs and they would sit on top of their house for meals, for socializing and things like that. So if people were on top of their housetops, then they would see the destruction coming, and then they were to flee. Jesus was speaking of something terrible about to happen in Judea, and there is nothing in this passage to indicate that this is a worldwide event. Just have a look at some parallels in Mark 13 and Luke 21. Now, Daniel 9:26 and 27 says that the man of righteousness will put an end to sacrifices, or this man will put an end to sacrifices. Now, if you know the book of Hebrews, Jesus is the one who put an end to sacrifices. And we're going to look at that in the next coming chapters, and in a couple of chapters later. If you've read my book already, you would have seen my interpretation of Daniel chapter 9. But just briefly, I can tell you that that was referring to Jesus. Daniel chapter 9 was referring to Jesus. He was the one who put an end to sacrifices. Now, have a look at Luke 21. It says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." Now, why have I included Daniel chapter 9 with Luke 21? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the word desolation is an important one, because in Daniel chapter 9 it refers to the abomination of desolation. And so this is key, because we have to understand that that abomination of desolation was referring to the Jerusalem armies. And so we see there when Jesus says that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, he then says in Luke 21 that those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now, it's not worded that way in Matthew chapter 24. And if you read Matthew chapter 24, you go, well, it's just saying those who are in Judea must flee, you must flee. But clearly, we can see in Luke 21 that when they must flee was not the end of the world, but it was when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. It's quite clear. Mark 13 verse 14 says it this way, and here is why I've put in Daniel chapter 9, because Mark says, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." Now, this is just so wonderful, because that confirms right there the abomination of desolation was the armies of Rome coming in. Because Luke 21 has just said, when you see the armies of Rome surrounding Jerusalem, then know its desolation is near. Then if you're in Judea, you must flee. And Mark 13 then refers to the same thing, but he actually uses the words abomination of desolation, which clearly tells us that these gospel writers were referring to Daniel chapter 9, which was a prophecy a lot of end-time people get so hyped up about, and actually it clearly refers to the armies of Rome that surrounded Jerusalem. Remember, the abomination of desolation does not refer to an antichrist. Nowhere in the Gospels, especially in this passage, is an antichrist mentioned. The only place that an antichrist is mentioned, and I will let you know a little bit later on in a couple of slides later, but the only place that an antichrist is mentioned is in the book of 1 John, and it's a spirit. It is not actually a person. People get mixed up with Revelation. The book of Revelation talks about a beast, a mark of the beast, and someone who rises up, or an empire, whatever it may be. We'll look at it later. But something that rises up, a beast that rises up and demands worship, and people receive its mark in order to buy and sell. And people take 1 John's antichrists with that beast, and they put it together. And actually, 1 John is not talking about an antichrist, it's talking about a spirit. And so we got to remember that the abomination of desolation is not referring to an antichrist. Luke 21:20 clearly tells us that the abomination was the armies surrounding Jerusalem. Have a look. John Chrysostom says the same thing. He says the abomination of desolation means the army by which the holy city of Jerusalem was made desolate. Josephus says the same thing. So all hope of escaping was now cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city. And that actually relates to further of Jesus' prophecies there in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 20. Historically, we know that the early disciples actually did flee. So Jesus has said, if you see that abomination, flee. If you're in Judea, flee. And historically, we know that the disciples made it out of Jerusalem before its destruction. Have a look at Eusebius. He writes this about their fleeing. The members of the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to acceptable persons there were prophecies that came from prophecies in the early church saying, this is coming, you need to get out. And so by means of an oracle, they were ordered to leave the city before the war began, and they settled in a town in Perea called Pella. I encourage you to look that up. A lot of Christians were known to have fled to Pella. Thomas Aquinas says the same thing. When the approach of the war with Rome and the extermination of the Jewish people, all the Christians who were in that province, warned by the prophecy, fled far away, as church history relates, and retiring beyond Jordan, remained for a time in the city of Pella. And then, in verses 21 and 22, Jesus talks about a great distress such as had never been experienced and never will be experienced. Now, as we saw in the earlier video, 2 videos ago, based on chapter 5 of my book, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was arguably the most devastating genocide in all history. It was disgusting. The famine, the siege that caused famine, that caused hunger, that caused disgusting things to happen before the Romans even came in. And then the Romans came in and they slayed people left, right, and center. The blood was running in the streets. And then there was still a fire that completely decimated whatever was left. So we know that it really was a horrendous thing to go through. And so it's a very, very strong point that Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And what's also key is Jesus says in this verse, he says, will never be experienced again, which actually means he's referring to the future. He's saying there's going to be a long future after this. Something's going to happen, and then it's never going to be experienced again. So that's key to understand. If Jesus was referring to the end of the world, why would he say that it's never going to happen again? Do you see the logic? You see, if Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, then we know that that kind of Holocaust, that kind of genocide is never going to happen again. Yes, there were terrible persecutions, there were terrible genocides that happened in many years later, with Rwanda, with World War II, many of these things, but they were not on the same scale as what happened in Jerusalem in 70 AD. Josephus even writes that it went beyond Jerusalem. He says in his book, The Wars of the Jews, which was published in modern times in 1998, there was not any one Syrian city which did not slay their Jewish inhabitants, and were not more bitter enemies to us, the Jews, than were the Romans themselves. So you see it spread even beyond Jerusalem, and the Syrian cities were destroying and wiping out the Jewish populations as well. This really was a horrific time for Jews to be alive. And then in verse 23, Jesus says again that false Christs would appear. It's interesting because Jerome actually says, at the time of the Jewish captivity by Rome, many Jewish elders claimed to be the Christ. There were so many, in fact, that there were 3 distinct camps of these false Christs when the Romans besieged Jerusalem. And now we move on to chapter 7 of my book. We're still on part 2 of interpreting Matthew 24, but in my book I separate this into the next chapter, and now we get into chapter 7. There's only just a few points here, literally only 2 slides of chapter 7, and then the final session of Matthew chapter 24, we cover the rest of chapter 7 of my book. In verse 28, Jesus refers to vultures. He says that where you see the vultures gathering, there is the dead corpse. Or where the dead corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now what's interesting is the Greek word that is used by Matthew is actually the word aietos. And if you look at it in the King James Version, that word aietos actually is better translated as eagle. According to Greek scholars, that word meant eagle more than it meant vultures. And a lot of the interpreters actually took the word and they just said because Jesus was referring to a corpse, he must have been referring to vultures, because vultures go after corpses and not eagles. But it's interesting because the King James uses the word eagle, which is a little bit more accurate to the Greek translation. And what's amazing is that the Roman army insignia was that of an eagle. The Romans circled Jerusalem and they were ready to devour it like a corpse. They were circling Jerusalem. They had sieged it for 6 months. So they had been circling Jerusalem like vultures, like eagles, if you like, and they were ready to descend upon it when it was weak, when it was dying, and they descended upon it. So this clearly is a wonderful reference to the Roman armies. The Roman armies would actually come in, they would march into battle, and some men would stand with staffs, very big long staffs, and these staffs had an eagle at the top. And so isn't that incredible that Jesus says, where there is the corpse, there the eagles will gather. It's pretty self-evident. And then just to confirm, there's some amazing stuff here, just to confirm that Jesus really was answering the disciples' first question in Matthew 24, 1 to 27, what's interesting is neither Mark nor Luke record the second and third questions. Now that's interesting because this is significant, and I just want to read to you what I've written here. This is significant because it gives us a clear framework in which to understand Matthew 24. Since Mark and Luke record only the question about the temple being destroyed, and the answers Jesus then gave in those Gospels are identical to Matthew 24, 4 to 28, it is only reasonable to conclude that Jesus was talking about the temple's destruction when he spoke about false Christs, wars, earthquakes, famines, and persecution. It cannot be emphasized enough how catastrophic the temple destruction was to the Jewish people. It was literally their heritage that was completely destroyed. This event finalized the end of the old religious system, which had its pinnacle in the holy temple. I hope this has given you some understanding. I hope you're starting to see that these passages in Matthew chapter 24 really do line up significantly with the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We will have a look at some more and explore the rest of Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 in the next video.